In this demo, we're going to review how data binding works and show how it's supporting the view model and the model types and getting that data on screen. Starting point for this one is the end of the XAML wire-up demo at the beginning of the module. So if we go open up our customer list view, before we were using a data grid with auto-generate columns to true, which it is by default. I'm going to replace this with one that has more explicit column definitions. Now we can see we have our data grid. It's still bound to the customers collection exposed by our view model, but now we have individual column definitions and they have their own bindings. As discussed before, this item source is able to bind to the customer's property because the overall data context for the view was set to the view model. These bindings down here are also data context bindings, but they're not binding against the view model itself because of the way an item source works. When an item source binds to its collection, it renders out a container for each item it's rendering, and it sets the data context of that container to the item. So the overall data context for each cell within a row here is going to be an individual customer in that collection. So these bindings can just use the simple path syntax here to point to properties on the individual customer that the row is being rendered out for. Now to see things in action here, we're going to go expand some of our properties. So let me go to my customer list view model and drop down to my customer property and expand it to have a backing member variable. Likewise, I'm going to drop into the customer model object type and find the first name property and expand it. Now we can go back to our view model and I'm going to set a breakpoint on the setter of the customer's property on the line of code in our constructor that's actually going to try to set that by first going out to the repository and getting customers. And then I'll drill down into that customer's repository to the getCustomers method and set a breakpoint here so that we can visualize the lifecycle here. So if I start up now, basically XAML parsing is happening. We're starting at the top here, and it's trying to construct our view model. So it comes into our view model constructor now, and it's trying to execute this line of code, which means it first has to go execute getCustomers async. If I hit F5 to run, we'll hit that line of code inside the repository where it's doing its async call to the database to get the customers back. And then when that call completes, if I run again, now we see we're in the set block for our customers property because this property setter up here is being called. Now if I go ahead and put a breakpoint on the get block for the customer and the get block for the customer first name property, and go ahead and run again. Now we see the get block of the customer's property is being called. And this is the data binding that's in the view right here on the item source that now needs to be resolved and is going to pull those customers into the data grid. If we execute further, now we can see the getter of each customer object, first Derek there, then Bernard, and so on, as it's rendering out the individual rows of the data grid. Now we'll go ahead and run past all that. And because this data grid is editable by default, we can see the bidirectional nature of the bindings, which allows us to communicate back down into those view model properties or model properties. In this case, I'm going to set a breakpoint on the set block of the customer, and we'll go ahead and edit Derek's first name here. Now the way the data grid works by default is that I can tab off that field and it's going to buffer those changes in memory until I actually change focus off of the row, and then it actually goes and sets all of the properties that were modified as part of that editing process. So now we can see the setter being called for this first name property because we edited it. So you can see that the data bindings to view model properties and to model properties form a bidirectional communication path. First to pull data into the view from the view model or model properties, and then to push data back down when things change in the view.